I think honestly, some of the religious or faith or philosophy leaders point to, like even Pope Leo now and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, of having shared secular ethics. It's just the same values. Some of the best interfaith dialogues I have with friends and colleagues are when we recognize we really do have a lot more in common and shared values, but we may go about them in different ways. And so I think, kind of, again, we have to keep focusing on what we do have that's shared.
In class this week, we've been talking about deviance and crime, and the group activity I have my students do is called You Be the Judge. And I have some real life scenarios, and they in groups have to decide, was anybody deviant, is there any punishment, etc. And then afterwards, I tell them, what really happened. And usually they're pretty appalled by what really happened. But what a change that I made a couple years ago was because they had a list of punishments they could apply, everything from house arrest. And I use a global example, so keep that in mind. Everything from house arrest to flogging across the board. And they could also choose execution if they wanted the death sentence. I changed it or tweaked it such that if the students in the group do choose one of the more extreme lethal forms of punishment, somebody in the group has to be willing to do it.
Yeah.
And there has been such a radical shift. It used to be, before, they were very kind of off the cuff. Life in prison, lethal injection, amputate a limb, all those kind of very extreme things. But the moment you put them in the space where they had to do it, that really humanized the whole experience. And nobody in their group is willing to do anything extreme to another person. And so I guess part of my question is wondering about the distance that we have as a society in many instances from the experience of those who are incarcerated. People are kind of locked up over there. For the vast majority of people, they might know a person who is incarcerated, but oftentimes a lot of people serve their sentences away from the community that they are a part of. So it's not an experience in which a lot of times people are here. It's them over there. Same thing with prison construction, not in my backyard, over there. And so I think, and I'm wondering if that serves to dehumanize people in a way.
I think you're absolutely right. It makes me think of Emery Bogardus and that social distance scale sociologists sometimes talk about, right? And yeah, it's so true that if you don't see it or have that experience, it's hard to conceive of or understand. And then it's hard to, it's easy to dehumanize if you've just heard hate and vitriol and have no idea of who that is or a real life person. But the more that, and I guess that's why with the innovative solutions, I was talking so much or rambling about all these ways to bring us together and have shared values or cross the aisles, is because the more I think that we do have exposure to one another and recognize that we're more alike than different, the better that we can, yeah, humanize and understand one another, especially with stigmas, I think is the best way to do it. And so many people don't disclose. And so you don't even know how many people, because, we have like what, 1 in 4 that have mental health issues, like 1 to 3 to 4 that experience domestic violence. With our prison system, I know the stats are quite similar as well. So it's very, very likely that we do, and we just don't realize because of the stigma. No one talks about it. And so I think that's why the storytelling, lived experience, volunteering is so helpful. But I think you're so right. I used to teach a summer class with high schoolers at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and they were predominantly upper middle class white. And we'd do a graffiti walk, and a lot of times we would see F the police. And we would talk about the different graffiti and how it's different than their communities or what the circumstances are. And we'd have to use our sociological perspective and imagination to walk away and be like, well, why do you think that is? What's your relationship to the police? Well, what do you think the relationship to the police is? Why would somebody do this? And a lot of times this is a real, like you were discussing, like you be the judge or putting yourself in those shoes to really do it will radically shift people's opinions and understandings of, wow, well, if the police weren't always at my beck and call and believe me and do everything I want in this way, it would be very different if, I couldn't access public transit without getting profiled or, we're over policed in certain areas, whatever may be the case, or we're not given due process. And, kind of the circumstances that are coming up really changes it. That's why I love experiential learning. That's why I love volunteering. That's why I love bringing in different guest speakers. And this podcast is powerful, because the more people you can know, the more people you can talk to, the more. That's why traveling and exposure to culture and all these things are so helpful, because you start to hear the similarities and humanize one another instead of, othering and dehumanizing and distancing ourselves.
Something you said made me think of the Stanford Prison Experiment. So I was wondering, why do you think maybe these individuals reacted that way? And in the way of like becoming this, even though they weren't in prison, they did have this oppressive environment and they created this like role of a guard, abusive guard, and like a submissive prisoner. Why do you think this sort of phenomenon happened, and how do you think it affects like the social roles and individual behavior in society?
That's a really good question. And that's a excellent. The Stanford Prison Experiment is just great, and Philip Zimbardo's work with that later on that he went to call his book on the Lucifer effect is really fascinating, right? And Stanley Milgram kind of found a similar thing where we follow authority, and we know, unfortunately, and I think we're seeing this again in many ways, that some of the most normal people make the best Nazis or the best oppressors. We all, unfortunately, have this within us, I guess, for better or for worse. And I think how much we can face it and understand it helps. But essentially, just they've done it even, I think other criminologists have done this even with policing and putting themselves in the role of a police officer. And so we very much become what we role play, or whatever costume we put on, or whatever position we're in. And it really does seem to be that this like absolute power kind of ends up corrupting. And if you're not mindful or aware, a lot of people will run with it for many different reasons. The rewards, or how our society is constructed, or because we want to belong. And like with the Stanley Milgram, we want to comply and we want to be seen as good, citizens. And so if we're being told to conform in certain ways, or told to, I guess, in the Milgram or the Stanford Prison Experiment, be the guard or discipline them or put shocks to them. Or in this case with ICE, people are being told to not question anything and abduct and kidnap and assault people. Then, we're in a real life Stanford Prison Experiment right now. And it does seem that certain people, by and large, most people will comply instead of question authority or stand up for their morals, or to speak out, and kind of in the example, even within the Stanford Prison Experiment, right? It was his graduate assistant. She was the one that had to speak out a few times. And it had to be pretty severe deleterious consequences of those that were the incarcerated individuals decompensating and asking to be released. So it took a lot of voices in most of these scenarios to even get them to stop. Continuing to pursue the work of, Zimbardo and others that have looked into this, we really, because of how the world is socially constructed, I think we really have to be mindful of the roles that we get into, the tendencies, um, of human psychology, or to want with our egos, right? To want certain things, and then also to want belonging and acknowledgement. It's just kind of like children, right? Like kids that act out or are negative aren't necessarily doing it to be jerks. They're just doing it because they want attention, or they have needs that aren't getting met in certain ways. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of these individuals that we see fulfilling, in military positions or guard positions or something, are also trying to get a sense of belonging and accolades. And it just might not be the most productive way for our society at large or for them. And it may be a bit short sighted. but that need of theirs seems to be so significant to want, acceptance or belonging or accolades or whatever that may be fulfilling for them, that tends to override. And obviously, this is a blanket kind of notion. I think it can be slightly different for certain individuals and reasons and rationales, but we really get very influenced by um, our environment. And my understanding too with authoritarianism, right, in some similar ways, is a lot of it comes out of fear and kind of some of these unmet needs or ideas, and then wanting, to have what, I won't lie, it's been hard. The vision I was promised as a child in society and where I thought my career and what I could do has radically altered in just a few decades. And there's a lot of grief involved in that. And I think this is where, so what I love, love, love about sociology is it talks all the time about the ideal and the real. And seeing between those two is very much like pulling and seeing the man behind the curtain. And so many do not want to see that or look at the reality and just fixate on this ideal or this fantasy. And that's what I think the oligarchy and the tech world and AI are relying on and want to shove us into. And there are some other positive components to it, don't get me wrong, but by and large, you know, that fantasy level is not healthy to live in. And we can't always live there. So we have to do a lot more to work with acceptance and keep our feet on the ground and really look more equitably, although that's a charged word now, you
Mhm.
know, at the situation and have that critical thinking and long-term vision. So it's going to require a bit of value shifting and investigation, critical thinking really of the values. I think we have a lot more of the same values, really, but we just have very different ideas of how to get there and how to investigate the real versus the ideal. We have an administration that's claiming this ideal, but the reality is very, very different.
Think the real versus ideal. There's psychology we've been reading for our like professional development at our advisor position, and it talks about events and non-events. And so I think the grief of now you don't have the kind of ideal or whatever version you thought you would grow into is very impactful because it's now a non-event. It didn't happen, and that's still something that's going to impact your, life choices or, future opportunities for you. So that's a little more psychology, but I think it still applies to everything that's happening around us right now.
Where do cultural differences fit in that? And cultural differences as they relate to the expectations of ideal versus real. I mean, one of the beauties of this culture and this society is that we are so multicultural. On the other hand, that also seems to be the thing that a lot of people have problems with. So, how do we manage that from your perspective?
That's an excellent question because even as we were creating the zines, we were thinking about kind of the different cultures and components and people and who's going to respond to what type of art or individuals. And so you do want to create a multiplicity of avenues for people to connect to. But I think what I always like is what I think honestly some of the religious or faith or philosophy leaders point to, like even Pope Leo now and His Holiness the Dalai Lama, of having shared secular ethics. And I know secular is a tough term for some people, so maybe pull that out. It's just the same values. Some of the best interfaith dialogues I have with friends and colleagues are when we recognize we really do have a lot more in common and shared values, but we may go about them in different ways. And so I think kind of again, we have to keep focusing on what we do have that's shared, I think everybody has a shared love of the country, including all the immigrants. I think Americans are very hardworking, all of us across the board. I think mostly everybody values faith, and you can kind of look at these. Robin Williams was a sociologist often cited about kind of the 10 core from the 1970s core values of America. But even back then, this in group, out group component was still part of the shared values that kind of comes up. We valued innovation and progress and this whole component. So I think that if we can keep in mind and come together over those better, and then allow, just like person-centered planning or a lot of these evidence-based practices or anything even in healthcare and healing, right? You have a general idea of whatever you're trying to treat is, or what the concern or the problem is, right? But then you have a box of options or ideas, and they're going to vary by individuals. Like in healthcare, right? The placebo is 50%. And so for some people, faith and prayer works really well. For other people, it's green spaces and nature. For other people, it's doing their own, visualizations. For some people, the vitamins, even though there might not be a lot of, can help, or different supplements, right? Or a combination of Western and their own cultural practices, honestly, is that fusion. I think more and more, again, kind of like push this interdisciplinary, because I don't think it's just one thing. We really have to kind of celebrate those differences. It sounds a little cliched, but it's very true. And I think they do shift over time. And I think the challenge is that we're in a time where the divisiveness and the political kind of theory or tactics that are being used are so black and white, and are so interested in demonizing and not understanding anything else, which is really antithetical to, I think, the American values and what was founded. People wanted to come and express their own religious freedom was a huge part of it. And I think we are richer for that and really have a lot of exposure and innovation. I think some of our biggest strengths as a country are because of it. We're going to see a very tough Christmas and holiday as we create these barriers with tariffs and as we lose immigrants and individuals, because we need the kindness of others, the interdependence of everyone. And I think we forget that. The clothes that we're wearing, the glasses that I'm wearing, the car that we're driving, we live in a global society and world. And so there's people in every way, shape, and form of something that I'm touching today, from my laptop, from my iPhone, from my glasses, from the clothes that I wear, that are from very different cultures and practices. And, and this is where sociology again reminds us of this interdependence that we have, and the global vision and the sociological perspective that has us look at the historical and the descriptive and the local and, larger analysis. But we do have to keep those in mind, and we have to be able to not be so, I think it just goes back to not being so fear-based. I have learned throughout my life, if I can stay curious and compassionate, or have an iota of kindness to myself and others, I can get through really challenging things. And I think we're at a time in our country where people are not connecting as much as I'd like to that curiosity and open-mindedness and compassion. And that is why we are, I think, experiencing some really tough challenges with one another, within our families, within the world, because we've kind of lost sight of that. And I think, unfortunately, the technology is pushing us, right? We've had decades of data about getting pushed into different echo chambers, or even read articles on the conversation about how politically people will shop in different places, and you can kind of silo yourself completely. And again, that kind of leads earlier to what y'all had suggested in a couple different ways about the dehumanization. And so we're just pushing ourselves into a corner, culturally, and just like a scared little animal. Honestly, that's what a lot of these individuals look like to me. And it's hard to stay compassionate to them when there's so much harm they're causing on so many levels. But that has been my focus, and what I hope others will aspire to is trying to stay fearless and compassionate and curious, or find your own, use your own critical thinking to find the solutions for yourself. I certainly can't claim to have all the answers, and I can't claim that even my answers will work for others. And I think that goes back to that cultural, the imperatives necessity for having that openness to different cultural components, because I think different cultures will value different ways that their culture has persevered or adapted over time. And that kind of warrior mentality, or those different mentalities, I think will shift a little bit. But I think at the end, that we have much more in common, and we'll bring each other much more benefit together.
I heard once, and it was actually in reference to religion and spirituality, is that if we look at it like we would look at learning styles. Some people are audio learners, some people are visual learners. We all have different learning styles. It doesn't mean we're not coming to the same place or we can't get to the same space. But learning to accept that not everybody has the same learning style as everybody else, and that's okay. That's nothing to be fearful of or try to fight against. Kind of going in the same direction. If funding was no object, Heather, what would you like to research?
Oh gosh. Honestly, Nadine Burke Harris is really wonderful. She does a lot with child abuse and child trauma out in California, in the government, and as a researcher. And I really am kind of fixated on inequality and child abuse. I think that's the number one public health issue, and it relates even to our system of mass incarceration. I think the majority of people wouldn't be in it if they didn't experience childhood trauma in some form of neglect or abuse or otherwise. Even state violence. We're seeing more and more state violence now, with losing school lunches and food, and the inequality. And inequality is what I specialized in with my doctorate, and there's very few programs that do. It is the biggest driver right now of all of our problems, and will certainly be the end of our civilization yet again if we continue this extreme excess of wealth. It's History has shown it time and time again. And so I would love to really study how we could do better in different ways over a longitudinal study, because we don't often have money for longitudinal and qualitative work, in a big mixed method study, to really figure out how we can, follow up to improve it. Like New Mexico just has, I think they're trying to do both free college and new childcare program for the whole state. It would be so cool to implement, right? For instance, like a really wonderful study where you're following from birth onwards, almost like the Harvard study where they followed the gentleman, throughout life forever. Um, to find out, how does that impact them? How helpful is it, when you have that free childcare and Head Start programming and early intervention and supports in these ways? And then when you can pursue VOTEC school or a 4-year degree or an apprenticeship, and money's not an issue, and you can really follow what you're passionate about and makes sense to you. So that would be my kind of first thought. It's not the universal income. We've done a few pilots and studies to see that. Um, but really figuring out something around that. And I wish there was a way to help people be better parents. Um, it's and I think that just goes back to, they didn't get it. I'm not trying to blame them. We don't teach it very well or across the board, and there's no requirement. And we don't have a lot of amazing models, and it's very expensive and challenging. And, I have a friend who wanted children so badly and couldn't find a good partner for various reasons, and did it on her own. And I support her. And it's wonderful. But we really need more than just one person to raise someone. And a lot of the studies with troubled teens is they need those coaches, they need those family friends, they need the Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts leaders or the church leaders or whatever extracurricular summer camp counselors are amazing. They need those. We need these as we go through development over our life course. So trying to research and study how to really get our hands around that. And that's because I think if we did that, we would not need prisons, and I could really be an abolitionist, you know, and that would be the ultimate goal of not having them. And I say all that and think about New Mexico as a place to research with the free childcare and free education, and then kind of maybe implementing some, interpersonal or relational healing or all these, what could emerge to figure out that we need ongoing education or support in to create a society like that. I think of it because we had a keynote speaker once at a critical criminology conference at Eastern Michigan, and one of the alum from the master's program there was Canadian, because we're not that in Michigan. I wasn't that far from Canada. And she did a fantastic keynote. And I apologize, I can't remember her name, but on studying Indigenous communities and how they did not need or have prisons. And they also did not have child sexual assault and abuse and pedophiles and those kind of components. And obviously with the Epstein files and all that's going on in the world, this is a huge problem. Predominantly, it seems like male, pale, and stale individuals, but we know it is people in power and money. And I don't have time to list everyone or what goes on in the news that we've all probably seen. But in her keynote, when you have smaller communities where you know one another and people have a village to support and raise and learn one another and keep it in check, those individuals that were developing for whatever reasons, not pro-social tendencies, were exiled or asked to leave. And without the support of the community, they could not survive. And there wasn't the surplus populations or amount of people, so they couldn't just go to the next community. Like we have serial practices of individuals that leave that are either police or professors or different people that get kicked out of jobs, and they can just hide somewhere else. And what she was studying was that wasn't possible. They really felt the consequence and really understood kind of the golden rule of treat one another as you want to be treated, because it was inherent for survival. So I don't know how we adapt in a world with so many people where we've shifted. And so that would be, I guess, the crux in a way behind the research question. I know this is a very long answer, but how to embed that in like looking at the inequality and child abuse, because I think that's where it starts. And her example of that keynote was that it really prohibited any of those nefarious elements or predation issues of the youth from happening when you had these smaller kind of self-policing and collective values. And people were really intimidated by being exiled. I don't think that the consequences are the same in this day and age. We obviously see there is no justice for a lot of individuals. So I hope we could get back to it by providing social supports and starting from very young. Maybe New Mexico will show us some of these answers down the road with what they're doing. So I'm still very hopeful.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for studying with us today. We hope you walked away with at least one little nugget of truth. Heather always has so many. So thank you for joining. And then stay tuned for our next podcast episode where we'll study another social science and reality topic.